So when I was done with my first fleet tour in VF-32, I got orders to VT-86 down at NAS Pensacola to be a flight instructor for student radar intercept officers. And I was down there for about a year enjoying teaching RIOs how to do an intercept and how to be a co-pilot during air combat maneuvering and how to run a low level and do chart prep and all of those kinds of things. Enjoying living in Pensacola, a great city. And I got a phone call from the editor of Approach magazine, a guy named Dave Hey-Joe Parsons, who was another Tomcat Rio. And I knew Hey-Joe from the Tomcat community, but I also was a contributor to the magazine he was the editor of, Approach, in a very unorthodox way. I did a cartoon called Brown Shoes in Action Comics. And so Brown Shoes, over the years I'd been doing it, became kind of an underground sensation. And it was an unorthodox part of Approach magazine, which is part of the Naval Safety Center there in Norfolk, Virginia. And so Hey-Joe was about to leave, and he was told by the commander of the Naval Safety Center, find somebody like you to keep Approach magazine in the limelight. And so he said, I only know one guy, Admiral, and that's Ward Carroll. However, he's already on shore duty down at VT-86. And the Admiral, who's Bad Fred Lewis, another Tomcat icon, said, I don't care, we'll get a waiver, just see if he wants to come up here and do this. So long story short, I very much wanted to do that. And so I wound up doing a split shore tour. I was at VT-86 only about a year plus, and then I got orders back to Norfolk in the Naval Safety Center to take over as the editor of Approach magazine. So Hey-Joe had started theme issues during his time as the editor, and they were very popular. So I wanted to keep those going. My assistant editor was a well-known naval aviation writer named Peter Mirsky. And so Peter and I were brainstorming on our editorial calendar. What themes should we do when? And are there any other themes that we should do? And Peter had this idea based on the fact that the president at the time was George H.W. Bush, who most know was a pilot, an Avenger pilot in World War II. In fact, he was a junior man in his squadron at the time, and he was shot down. His crew was killed, and he survived. He was rescued by a submarine. An amazing story. And so the practical question was, do we have any way to get to George H.W. Bush, President Bush? And the answer was yes. His military assistant was a Tomcat guy who I later worked for when he was the Air Wing commander of CAG 1 and I was CAG Ops, Boomer Stuffelbeam. And so we reached out to Boomer and go, hey, can we get the president to sit down for an interview about naval aviation safety? And so Boomer was like, I don't know if he's going to be able to sit down, but maybe I can get him to answer some questions in writing. So President Bush did that. And so now we jump-started the idea of a aviation greats talking about aviation safety theme issue. And so we called this theme issue Reflections. And among the notables in there was Whitey Feitner, General Tom Miller, who was instrumental in getting the Harrier introduced to the Marine Corps, Alan Shepard, and Admiral Stockdale, a Medal of Honor recipient after being a POW for 7 years. And also, we wanted to interview Senator John Glenn. Now, I'm sure you've heard of John Glenn, but just as a reminder, John Glenn was a Marine Corps pilot who did a exchange tour with the Air Force during the Korean War and wound up shooting down 3 MiGs. After that, he was a test pilot. He did a thing called Project Bullet, where he flew an F-8 supersonic coast to coast and hit the tanker along the way and broke the speed record going coast to coast. And he was in the first group of NASA astronauts. So again, the question is, do we know anybody in Senator Glenn's office who might be able to facilitate an interview? And the answer was yes, we did. His military assistant was an A-6 pilot. And so we reached out to him. He said, basically, yes, the senator would like to do an interview, and I can probably give you 45 minutes. So can you come up here to D.C. and let's do this interview? So we had that interview scheduled. Now, at the same time, while I was the editor of Approach, I was able to fly with squadrons at the Naval Air Station Oceana, which is nearby, about 25 miles away from the base at Norfolk where the Naval Safety Center was. And so I would fly with Tomcat squadrons. I would fly with VFC-12, which was the reserve squadron that flew the A-4. And then I was able to fly with the aggressor squadron, VF-43. In fact, their schedule officer was a Tomcat Rio who I was friends with, would hook me up quite often when they had an empty back seat. So I was flying all kinds of sorties. So I called Genghis Khan, and said, hey, I'm interviewing John Glenn on this day. Any way we can take a A4 up there and land at Andrews? And, instead of having to drive, I could fly up there. And he's like, well, let me ask the ready room. And so he called me back. He's like, yeah, Trucker Boyd would very much like to do this. Will he be able to meet John Glenn? I said, yes, I'll take him along so we can meet John Glenn. So then I called base ops at Andrews Air Force Base, and I said, hey, can we get like a duty driver, a van to take us from the transit line to Capitol Hill to interview John Glenn? And their question was, can we meet John Glenn? And I was like, yeah, I probably can make that happen. And so the guy on the phone was like, yeah, I'll do it. So we were good to go. So the day came, and I had a mid-afternoon interview with Senator Glenn in his office. I want to say it was the Cannon office building there, on Capitol Hill. And so show up to the VF-43 ready room. Trucker and I brief the hop. I'd already done the flight planning. We file with Air Ops. It was just a simple, what we call an out and in, airways navigation along the jet routes to Andrews Air Force Base, hang out there for a couple hours, do the interview, come back, and then come home. Pretty simple mission. And so brief the flight, get our flight gear on, man up. After pre-flighting the airplane, jump in. So as we're starting the airplane up, Trucker notices that the nose wheel steering is not working. That was the only irregularity we had. And he's like, that's fine. In the A4, it's not a big deal to do differential braking to steer the airplane. Now, in the Tomcat, that's a bad idea. That's a good way to smoke a brake. You really do need nose wheel steering. But in the A4, it's not as crucial, and pilots know how to do the technique to do braking to steer it. So we're still going to press on. So pull the chocks, ground control, taxi to the duty runway, go up tower, take the runway. Go through the takeoff checks. Now, the takeoff checks include canopy. So in the A4, it has a redundant system. So you lower the canopy, and the lever's on the left panel, and then you have a mechanical device that's called the rifle bolt, and it's a lot like a rifle bolt. So you lower the canopy, and then you translate the rifle bolt into place. Now, if you do not translate the rifle bolt into place, when you go to military power to take off, you'll get an oral tone, a deedle as we call it, and a warning light. So it's sort of naval aviator proof. You have to try to take off without the rifle bolt in place. Canopy's down, rifle bolt in place, rest of the takeoff checks cleared to take off, power's up, trundling down the runway, get your rotation speed, leave the deck, gear's coming. I'm running the radios, doing my good Rio responsibility here, which Trucker is happy with because usually he's flying single seat and he has to talk on the radios. Now, Trucker was a Tomcat pilot. He had been his first tour in VF-143, the Puking Dogs, the squadron I was in later. So he was used to tandem seating and dealing with a Rio and so forth and so on. So we had good crew coordination. So I go up departure control as we're just airborne and taking off. I want to say we were on runway 5 at Oceana, which, heads out over the water. So just off the runway, departure control, Alpha Foxtrot 203, passing 500 feet for flight level 210. I didn't get a response. Wait, couple potatoes, try again. I keyed the radio, I said departure control, and as I was making that transmission, I suddenly noticed there was light under the canopy. So, you know how the mind works. You have this sort of time compression. So in my mind's eye, it looked like the canopy was floating off the hinges for, a pretty long period of time. In actuality, it was there for a millisecond. So the canopy just came off the airplane. And suddenly I'm getting buffeted by 230 knot winds. My knee board was ripped off my leg. All the pins that were in this bag on the port side were yanked out. And I'm just getting slammed by this wind blast. So my first instinct was to lower the seat all the way. And then I leaned forward and I could hear Trucker was talking to me, but I couldn't understand what he was saying because the wind blast was so substantial. And basically his first thought was I had somehow ejected, either intentionally or because there was some sort of aircraft failure. And so I leaned over the stick and got as much as I could out of the wind blast and said, "I'm still here." And that was basically the last thing I was able to say to him because there was no talking from my backseat. Now he had the glare shield, so he was kind of not being buffeted like the rear cockpit was. So I thought about disarming the seat by, you can pull down what's this head knocker so that the wind wouldn't loose the handle and maybe fire the ejection seat. But by this time I was like, I don't want to put my hands into the wind stream and maybe get them stuck up here. Trucker decelerated as fast as he could from 230 knots to about 150, 160 knots. The airplane was too heavy to land, so we had to go out over the water and dump fuel until we got to the max allowable landing weight. So that took a good 7 to 10 minutes to do that. And so this is like February. It is cold. And so I'm just back there trying not to inadvertently eject, trying to stay warm, and keep my arms out of the wind blast. So he's got all the radio comms now because I can't hear the radios. And also, if I was to try to talk, it would be garbled because of all the ambient noise of the wind blowing us around. So we come back around, gear coming. He does the landing checklist himself. Land. So finally, we're going slow enough that we can talk, right? Exit the runway, go to the VF-43 line. He'd already transmitted to maintenance control and their squadron duty officer that we lost the canopy. So we were greeted by the skipper, maintenance chief, a whole bunch of folks. And they're looking at us like, oh, wow. So I was like, oh, it must look pretty bad, right? So get out of the airplane. I pull the head knocker down. Now the pin to safe it was lost. The other thing about the A-4 is the intakes are pretty close to the rear cockpit in a TA-4. Fortunately, my knee board and these pins did not go down the intake and FOD the motor, because that would have been a catastrophic situation. So the other question we had, or the first question we were asked, was, were you feet wet when the canopy came off? And the answer is absolutely not. So they immediately jumped into the duty van, and they drove down Oceana Boulevard to Virginia Beach Boulevard. Meanwhile, they got a phone call from a lady who had called base ops. Base ops in turn called VF-43 and said, "Your canopy landed in my yard." So here's a picture of the canopy. It barely missed the house. Fortunately, all it clipped was one utility wire that went to her shed, and it landed next to a tree. The plexiglass is shattered. By the time the maintenance crew got there, the local NBC affiliate, Wavy TV 10, was already on the scene. So the first people she called was the news channel, and then she called base ops. So kind of bad form for the Navy to be jettisoning stuff over Virginia Beach. It was always a concern. You know, the mall is right there. Lynn Haven Mall is right there at the 180. Unfortunately, we've never dropped anything onto the Lynn Haven Mall in all the years that we've been flying over Lynn Haven Mall. So, you know, this is something that the local populace is concerned about. So when it actually happens, it's going to make the news. The next question was, why did the canopy come off? And they were kind of thinking, hey, guest player, did you pull the jettison handle? I'm like, no, I absolutely did not pull the jettison handle. I mean, give me a break. And then the question was, did you guys not have the rifle bolt in place? Because this was the classic TA4 student thing where a student who's just at high warble launches without the rifle bolt in place, ignores the oral tone, and when he's about to rendezvous on his flight instructor lead, gets to about 230 knots and the canopy comes off. That happened a lot, not a lot. It happened probably a dozen times in the history of the A-4. So Trucker and I both said that rifle bolt was absolutely in place. So they did the maintenance investigation, and it turns out that the airplane had just come out of a maintenance period where they had worked on the canopy and they had misrigged it. And so it behaved as if the rifle bolt wasn't in place when it was actually in place. So vindicated, so forth and so on. I actually was reunited with Trucker Boyd. So this happened in 1990, and I was reunited with Trucker Boyd in 2019 at the Tailhook Convention in Reno. So Trucker's now a Delta Airlines pilot, and he still, as you can see here, a handsome man. It was great to reconnect and retell the story of us losing our canopy. Now, the epilogue is I actually did do the interview with John Glenn, not that day. I had to call the military rep there and say, hey, we can't make it because we had a mishap on our way. So I wound up driving up to Washington, D.C. from Virginia Beach a couple of weeks later, sitting down with Senator Glenn. And the first thing he asked, or he said, and he was cracking up, he's like, okay, so let me get this straight. You are here to interview me about naval aviation safety, and you had a mishap on your way to interview me about naval aviation safety? I was like, yeah, Senator, that's what happened. Super cool guy. And he enjoyed talking about something other than being a senator and all of the food fights that happen on Capitol Hill. In fact, our session went twice as long as the allotted time. We had 45 minutes. It went an hour and a half. Staffers kept coming in and he was shooing them off. And he talked about everything that he had done from the time he got his wings until he flew the space shuttle. So what a gift. That issue came out fantastic. It was a great issue. I also wrote about the A-4 mishap in the companion publication at the Naval Safety Center that's aimed at maintainers called Mech Magazine. And so captured that story in Mech Magazine. So it all worked out great. All right. That's going to do it for this episode. Now, before I go, I want to tell you about a special deal on my debut novel, Punk's War. It is the 20th anniversary of Punk's War's original publication. So the Naval Institute Press is offering a special deal on the trade paperback version of Punk's War at usni.org/press/books punks-war. I'm putting this in the description for this episode as well. The book is on sale for the month of May for $4.99. That's 90% off the list price. Available to subscribers of the channel at usni.org, the original publisher of Punk's War. Cheaper than you can get it on Amazon, but if you like Amazon, it's available there too. It's also available as a Kindle on Amazon. Now, as I said in the community section of the channel, we're working on getting the entire Punk series published again. That's going to take some weeks to make that happen, so stay tuned about that. All right, that'll do it for this episode. As always, thanks so much for your support. Give me a thumbs up. These matter a lot in terms of episode impact. If you're a first-time viewer, ring the bell. Become a subscriber. Share, comment. The comments are fantastic. And as you've seen, I'm trying to respond to each and every one of you on the comments section. So thanks so much for your support, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.